An avoidant man does not fear love. He fears being witnessed. There is a difference most people never understand, and that difference is the reason so many women feel like they are speaking a language he refuses to learn. He can want closeness with every cell in his body and still recoil from the one gesture that would give him exactly what he is starving for. This is not weakness. This is architecture. Somewhere inside him, a blueprint was drawn long before he ever met you, and that blueprint decided which forms of affection register as safety and which ones register as danger. Most people try to love an avoidant man harder. That is the mistake that ends almost every attempt to reach him. There is one thing, small and almost invisible, that bypasses his defenses entirely, and it has nothing to do with giving him space or proving your loyalty. It works because it does not ask him to open the door. It removes the reason the door was ever locked. What that one thing is and why his nervous system cannot resist it is what you are about to understand. Every avoidant man carries a private theory about love that he has never said out loud, not even to himself. The theory goes like this: closeness is the price of admission, and abandonment is the bill that eventually comes due. He did not invent this theory through logic. He absorbed it through repetition, usually before he had the language to question it. A child who reaches for comfort and receives inconsistency does not conclude that the world is unpredictable. He concludes that reaching is the problem. This is the first hidden truth that almost nobody explains correctly. Avoidance is not the absence of longing. It is longing that has been trained to distrust itself. Consider what happens inside a nervous system that has learned this lesson early. The body still wants connection because the body was built for connection, but the mind now treats the want as a threat detector rather than a compass. When a woman offers warmth, his system does not simply receive it, it scans it. It asks whether this warmth is the beginning of another disappearance disguised as intimacy. This is why gestures that feel loving to you can feel loaded to him. You are not dealing with a man who cannot feel. You are dealing with a man whose feeling has been rerouted through a security system that never learned when to stand down. Here is where most explanations of avoidant attachment stop, and where the real psychology only begins. People assume the avoidant man wants distance because distance is comfortable. It is not comfortable. It is familiar. There is a profound difference between the two, and confusing them is why so many attempts to reach an avoidant man fail. Comfort soothes the nervous system. Familiarity only satisfies its need for predictability, even when the predictable thing is pain. A man can hate his own distance and still return to it, the same way a person raised in chaos can feel strangely uneasy in a quiet house. Silence to him is not peace. Silence is simply the sound he recognizes. This is the part almost no one talks about, and it is the second insight you need to sit with. The avoidant man often experiences your emotional openness as a demand, even when you have made no demand at all. This is not because he is cold. It is because somewhere in his internal architecture, emotional openness was once followed by obligation. Someone needed him to feel a certain way, to perform closeness on command, to manage another person's emotional state as though it were his job. So when warmth arrives now, even gentle warmth, some old alarm quietly asks what will be required of him in return. He is not rejecting you. He is bracing for a transaction he has not yet realized is not happening. Now ask yourself a harder question, one that most relationship content is too afraid to raise. What does it say about human beings that we can build entire emotional fortresses around a wound we cannot even name? This is not a flaw unique to avoidant men. This is a structural feature of the human psyche itself. We do not protect ourselves from what hurt us. We protect ourselves from the shape of what hurt us, and we mistake anything resembling that shape for danger, even when the person standing in front of us has nothing to do with our original wound. The avoidant man is not avoiding you. He is avoiding a ghost that happens to be wearing your voice. Empaths, meanwhile, carry their own unexamined machinery, and this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for the other side of this dynamic. The empathic partner often believes her sensitivity is purely a gift, a form of emotional generosity offered freely. But sensitivity without boundaries is not generosity. It is often an old survival strategy wearing the costume of virtue. Many empaths learned early that their worth was measured by how much emotional labor they could absorb on behalf of someone else. Reading a room, softening a mood, anticipating a need before it was spoken, these were not charming personality traits. These were coping mechanisms built inside households where safety depended on managing someone else's emotional weather. So when she meets an avoidant man, something old in her recognizes something old in him, and the recognition feels like chemistry when it is often something closer to reenactment. Pay close attention to this next distinction because it changes everything about how you approach him. There is a difference between reassurance and regulation, and almost every attempt to soothe an avoidant man confuses the two. Reassurance is verbal. It says, "Trust me, I am not leaving, I promise this is different." Regulation is behavioral. It is demonstrated through consistency, tone, patience, and the absence of pressure, repeated so often that his nervous system slowly updates its predictions without being told to. Words rarely reach an avoidant man, not because he does not believe you, but because his defenses were built by experience, and experience is the only currency they accept as valid. This brings us to something rarely discussed in mainstream psychology content, and it is the third surprising insight worth sitting with. Avoidant men often mistake their own withdrawal for independence, when in reality withdrawal is one of the least free things a person can do. True independence is the ability to choose closeness or solitude based on what genuinely serves you in the moment. Avoidant withdrawal is not a choice, it is a reflex, fired automatically the instant intimacy crosses an invisible threshold his body set years before he ever met you. A man who cannot choose to stay close is not free. He is simply obeying a different master, one that hides behind the language of self-sufficiency while quietly running his life from the shadows. Think about how strange this is when you slow down and examine it honestly. A man can consciously want a woman standing directly in front of him and simultaneously feel his entire body preparing an exit, not because she did anything wrong, but because closeness itself has been coded as a prelude to loss. This is the tragedy hiding inside almost every avoidant relationship pattern. It is not a story of a man who does not care. It is the story of a nervous system fighting its own desire, exhausting itself trying to want something it has also been trained to fear. Here is where the conversation must shift from explaining the wound to explaining the cure, because understanding pain without understanding the path forward only produces sympathy, and sympathy alone has never healed anyone. The one simple thing that reaches an avoidant man is not affection, and it is not distance either, though both of those approaches are what almost every woman tries first. The one thing that reaches him is emotional non-reactivity paired with unwavering presence. Say that again slowly because it sounds simple, but it is one of the most difficult psychological postures a human being can hold. It means staying warm without needing him to respond to your warmth in a particular way. It means remaining present without requiring reassurance that your presence is welcome. This single shift does something almost no other gesture can do. It removes the transaction his nervous system has been bracing for. Understand what this actually does to his internal wiring because the mechanism matters more than the behavior itself. When you stop reacting to his withdrawal with either panic or punishment, you are quietly teaching his nervous system something it has never learned before. You are teaching it that closeness does not have to be followed by demand, and distance does not have to be followed by abandonment. This is not a technique to manipulate his feelings. This is a demonstration, repeated patiently over time, that rewires what his body expects from intimacy. Most people try to convince an avoidant man with words that he is safe. Words cannot do this work. Only sustained, calm, undemanding presence can, because his defenses were built through lived experience, and only lived experience can dismantle them. Notice how this reframes almost everything you thought you understood about winning an avoidant man over. You are not trying to prove your love is different from every love he has known before. You are trying to prove through repetition that closeness itself is different from what his body has assumed it always becomes. This is a subtle but seismic distinction. He is not resisting you specifically. He is resisting a pattern, and patterns are only broken by new evidence delivered consistently enough that the old prediction finally loses its grip. Now consider the deeper philosophical layer buried underneath all of this, because attachment psychology, at its root, is really a conversation about freedom. A person who cannot tolerate closeness is not free, and a person who cannot tolerate solitude is not free either. Both states are cages built from fear, simply facing in opposite directions. The avoidant man fears being consumed. The anxious or empathic partner often fears being abandoned. Neither fear is more noble than the other, and neither person is the villain in the other's story. They are two frightened nervous systems mistaking each other's coping mechanisms for character flaws, when in truth both are simply doing what wounded systems do. They are protecting an old injury using whatever tools were available at the time it happened. This is precisely why blame accomplishes nothing in these dynamics, and why the healthiest approach requires something far more demanding than anger. It requires responsibility without self-erasure. This means the empathic partner must learn to hold compassion for his fear without absorbing it as her own emergency. This is an extraordinarily difficult skill because empaths are often wired to feel other people's discomfort as though it were happening inside their own body. Learning to witness his withdrawal without internalizing it as rejection is not coldness. It is one of the most emotionally mature disciplines a person can develop, and very few people ever master it, because it requires the empath to finally turn some of that famous sensitivity inward toward her own nervous system rather than constantly outward toward his. Here is a harsh truth that deserves to be said plainly, because most relationship content is too gentle to say it. No woman can love an avoidant man into permanent security. She can only create the conditions in which his own healing becomes possible, and whether he walks through that door is a decision only he can make. This is not defeatism. This is respect, both for him and for herself. Trying to force a wounded nervous system into safety through sheer effort or sacrifice is not love. It is control wearing a disguise of devotion, and it usually ends with one person completely depleted while the other person remains exactly as guarded as before. There is a second harsh truth sitting quietly beneath the first one, and it may be the most important insight in this entire script. The moment a woman needs an avoidant man to change in order to feel worthy, she has unknowingly handed him the exact power dynamic his defenses were built to protect against. Now he senses, correctly or not, that her emotional stability depends on his behavior, and this activates the very engine that drives him toward distance. This is the paradox almost nobody addresses. The more his change becomes necessary for her peace, the less capable he becomes of offering it, because now closeness has been reattached to obligation, and obligation is the exact thing his nervous system was designed to flee. So what does emotional mastery actually look like inside this dynamic, stripped of every romantic fantasy people attach to it? It looks like a woman who can want closeness deeply while remaining fundamentally whole without it. It looks like presence that does not collapse into anxiety when he retreats and does not harden into resentment when he returns. This is not passivity. This is one of the most powerful psychological postures a human being can inhabit because it communicates something no words ever could. It communicates that her worth was never contingent on his consistency in the first place. Think about how radical this actually is when placed against how most people are taught to approach relationships. Society tells you that love means proving your value through sacrifice, through patience, through absorbing another person's fear until they finally feel safe enough to stay. But real emotional mastery flips this entirely. It says your peace was never his responsibility to manage, and his healing was never yours to complete. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop outsourcing your own regulation to someone whose regulation is still under construction. This is where the deepest layer of this entire topic finally reveals itself, the layer almost no one reaches because it requires abandoning the fantasy of rescue entirely. The one simple thing that melts an avoidant man is not a technique performed on him. It is a state achieved within yourself first. Calm that does not depend on his response. Warmth that does not require reciprocation to remain intact. Presence that stays steady whether he leans in or pulls away. This state is nearly impossible to fake, which is precisely why it works. His nervous system, trained over years to detect performance and obligation, cannot find either one inside genuine self-possession. There is nothing to brace against because nothing is being asked of him. And in the absence of a demand, for the first time, he is finally free to choose closeness on his own terms, not because he was pulled toward it, but because nothing was pushing him away. A man who has spent years defending himself against closeness does not wake up one morning and decide to stop. Change of this kind arrives in fragments, almost invisibly, the way erosion reshapes a coastline without a single dramatic moment marking the transformation. This matters because most people expect healing to look like a breakthrough, a single conversation that unlocks everything. Real psychological change rarely works that way. It accumulates. Every time his nervous system predicts abandonment and instead encounters steadiness, a tiny fracture forms in the old belief. One fracture changes nothing. 1,000 fractures eventually collapse the entire structure. Picture a man standing inside a house he built himself, brick by brick, years before he understood what he was constructing. Each brick was laid during a moment when closeness cost him something, when vulnerability was met with mockery, indifference, or quiet withdrawal from someone who was supposed to be safe. He did not build this house because he wanted isolation. He built it because isolation was the only material available at the time that could stop the bleeding. Now, decades later, people stand outside this house and wonder why he will not simply open the door. They do not realize the door was never locked from stubbornness. It was locked from memory. This is where a deeper psychological principle enters the conversation, one rarely discussed with honesty. Healing does not happen because someone convinces the wounded person that safety exists. Healing happens because the wounded person eventually experiences enough repeated safety that the nervous system updates its threat assessment on its own. No one can argue a nervous system into trust. Trust is not a belief held in the mind. It is a pattern recorded in the body, and bodies only change through repetition, not persuasion. Consider what this means for the woman standing on the other side of that locked door. Her task was never to break it down through force of love, no matter how many books and songs suggest otherwise. Her task, if she chooses to stay at all, is to remain a consistent presence outside a door that may take longer to open than she would prefer, without losing herself in the waiting. This distinction separates emotional maturity from emotional dependency, and almost no one draws this line clearly enough. Waiting with peace is different from waiting with desperation, even though both can look identical from the outside. Something else deserves attention here, a fourth insight rarely spoken aloud in relationship psychology. Avoidant men frequently punish themselves internally for their own withdrawal, even while performing indifference on the surface. This self-punishment is invisible to the outside world, which is exactly why so many partners assume he simply does not care. In reality, many avoidant men lie awake replaying the moment they went cold, fully aware of the confusion or pain it caused, unable to explain why their body overruled their intentions yet again. This is one of the loneliest experiences a human being can carry, wanting connection desperately while watching yourself sabotage it in real time, as though observing a stranger operating your own hands. This reveals something profound about the nature of internal conflict itself, something that extends far beyond romantic relationships into the entire architecture of human suffering. Whenever two parts of a person want opposite things with equal intensity, that person does not experience peace. They experience paralysis disguised as choice. The avoidant man is not choosing distance over closeness the way someone chooses tea over coffee. He is being pulled in two directions by forces operating on different timelines, one shaped by present desire, the other governed by a much older, much more frightened version of himself, still running defensive protocols nobody bothered to update. Empaths often misread this internal war as personal rejection, and this misreading deserves its own careful examination because it represents the fifth insight worth sitting with. When an empathic partner absorbs his withdrawal as evidence of her own inadequacy, she is unknowingly repeating an old story from her own history, one where someone else's emotional unavailability was quietly translated into a verdict about her worth. This is not weakness. This is simply how early psychological conditioning operates, quietly assigning meaning to present events based on unresolved patterns from the past. Two people, each interpreting the other through the lens of an old wound, rarely see what is actually happening between them in the present moment. Now examine the philosophical undercurrent running beneath this entire dynamic, because it extends into a truth about human connection that applies far beyond avoidant attachment alone. Every relationship is, at its core, a negotiation between two nervous systems attempting to feel safe in each other's presence. When both systems are regulated, connection feels effortless. When either system is dysregulated, even genuine love can feel like danger. This reframes the entire conversation away from blame and towards something far more useful, which is nervous system literacy. Understanding your own triggers and understanding his is not about excusing harmful behavior. It is about finally seeing the mechanism clearly enough to respond with wisdom instead of reflex. Here is a question worth sitting with longer than feels comfortable. What if the goal was never to fix him at all? What if the entire premise of trying to become the woman who finally reaches an avoidant man is quietly reinforcing the very dynamic that keeps this pattern alive? There is a version of this story where healing him becomes her identity, her proof of worth, her secret mission disguised as devotion. This is a dangerous substitution because it slowly transforms love into a performance review, one where her sense of self rises and falls based on his emotional availability that day. This is not partnership. This is a covert contract neither person signed, but both are quietly enforcing. The sixth insight, and perhaps the most uncomfortable one, is this. Sometimes the healthiest outcome is not staying long enough to witness his transformation, but recognizing that your own peace should never be contingent on waiting for someone else's psychology to catch up to your needs. This is not a betrayal of compassion. This is compassion extended equally toward yourself. A person can hold deep empathy for why someone became guarded and still refuse to spend years standing outside a locked door, hoping it opens before her own life quietly passes her by. Discernment is not the opposite of love. Discernment is what allows love to remain honest instead of becoming self-abandonment wearing a noble costume. Here is the truth you must carry with you long after this video ends. You cannot love a locked door open. You can only become the kind of presence that makes opening it feel safe, and even then the choice was never yours to make for him. Stop measuring your worth by his willingness to stay close. Start measuring your peace by whether you can remain whole regardless of his answer. Today, choose one moment where you feel the urge to chase, explain, or prove yourself worthy of his closeness, and instead simply remain steady, silent, and secure within yourself. That single act of self-possession will teach his nervous system more than 1,000 words ever could. Remember this above all else. The people who heal us are rarely the ones who chase our wounds. They are the ones who refuse to abandon themselves while waiting for us to heal.